ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Want to get across the big breaking news stories right now? ABC News Top Stories explains the day's biggest stories in under 2 minutes. Search ABC News Top Stories podcast and hit follow or favourite to add us to your playlist.
It was one of the worst environmental disasters in Australia's history. When a massive algal bloom arrived in South Australia, devastating the coastline and killing marine life, the public was initially told it wasn't toxic, when it later became apparent it was. Today, Four Corners reporter Angus Grigg on his investigation into what the government knew and whether it acted fast enough. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Angus, why don't we start by talking about Anthony? Now, he is a surfer from South Australia, and around this time last year, he did go for a surf, and he came out of the water rather, unwell, didn't he?
Yeah, well, that's right. So in March last year, Anthony Rowland and a group of other surfers were out paddling in, catching some waves around Victor Harbour, which is just about an hour from Adelaide. And while they were in the water, they were coughing a little bit. They were a bit unwell.
I said, "Are you guys sick? Have you got a cough?" And they're like, "No, I've just started coughing out here today." And I'm like, "That's really weird, me too."
And then Anthony, when he paddled in and he posted on his Instagram and Facebook and a few other accounts, just been for a surf and noticed these symptoms, the cough, the sore eyes, the sort of itchy skin and things like that. And he's just sort of put it out there and said, did anyone else have these symptoms? And within a sort of day or so, he'd had about 100 responses of people saying, yeah, exactly the same symptoms.
Angus, it was in the days that followed that Anthony was really stunned by what he saw on the beach.
Yeah, he went back out to the beach and then he just noticed this carnage all along the beach near Victor Harbour. There was all sorts of dead marine life washing up.
So I haven't seen one of these guys for a while, and that just washed up in front of my eyes. You can see the bubbles are still popping.
And there was also, more worryingly, there was this sort of huge toxic scum on the water and this toxic foam that was washing in to the beaches. And that's when he started not only posting his pictures to social media, but also trying to get in contact with the department and find out, what had happened here.
Okay, and it was about a fortnight after this that Anthony starts noticing some very unwell kangaroos. So just tell me about that.
Yeah, so within about 4 or 5 days of those surfers getting sick, the South Australian government came out and said, look, we think there's an algal bloom. We're not really sure too much about it. And so Anthony was actually out doing some water samples, testing the water for this algal bloom when he noticed this mob of kangaroos down on another beach near Victor Harbour.
Poor buggers. What's going on?
And none of them were moving. And he thought, wow, these guys are really, really sick.
There's always hundreds of roos, always. And whenever you get to the bottom, they all see you and prick up and they just divide and get away. There was some kind of poisoning or something was going on. They looked half paralysed.
So he rang the authorities and he was told actually they were on top of it. They knew about this. They'd already put down 45 kangaroos and then had come back sort of the next day and put down another 60 odd. And look, authorities weren't really sure once again what had happened here, but it wasn't for a couple of months until they actually got the results back from some testing that they really discovered something pretty alarming in these kangaroos. They found something that had never been seen in Australia before, and that was this thing called brevitoxins.
Wow, okay. So these brevitoxins, they're found in kangaroos. And the concerning thing about that, Angus, is that these toxins are known to be harmful for humans. But we should note that the report didn't find the kangaroos died from brevitoxins. And the South Australian government says there were only trace amounts and it considered that incidental.
Yeah, so brevitoxins have been associated with algal blooms in Florida for 50 or 60 years, but it wasn't really thought that they were existent in Australia. And indeed, typically, we do have these algal blooms in Australia, but we don't typically test for this brevitoxin. And the reason why it's so significant, these brevitoxins, is that they can cause breathing difficulties, respiratory issues, particularly for asthmatics, for those with underlying health conditions. Also, there's studies in Florida that show, fairly significant upticks in hospitalizations from these brevitoxins during these algal blooms, but also gastro-like symptoms.
Yeah, and you have spoken to people who say this discovery, the discovery of these toxins in the kangaroos, should have warranted a pretty urgent investigation.
Absolutely. This discovery of brevitoxins, if you like, was the sort of break glass moment. That should have triggered wide-scale testing of fish, of crustaceans, of the seawater, of the foam, of other animals, like the kangaroos, but also, perhaps seagulls or other marine birds. And really, one of the big early failures of the South Australian government was they never did that testing. And so they never knew how widespread these brevitoxins were and what they'd got into.
And you spoke to Professor Shauna Murray, who's a global expert on the harms of these algal blooms. Now, she was really concerned, of course, because it also took the government 2 months for the pathology report to even show up on a government website.
Yeah, the timeline here is pretty alarming, actually. Brevitoxins were found in oysters, they were found in a shark, and they were found in these kangaroos. And that is a really big problem because I think the public deserve to know that this really dangerous compound had been found in Australia for the first time.
Our detection of brevitoxins is a trigger for a full investigation for what the producing organism was, where it's distributed, how much of it is there. We need to know everything, yeah.
And should the public be informed about that, do you think?
Brevitoxins are certainly a problem for public health, and as a member of the public, I'd like to know if brevitoxins are present.
Well, Angus, let's have a look more deeply at the South Australian government's response to all of this. Now, you sat down with Faith Coleman. She's an ecologist who has been documenting the algae's impact. She's actually now running as an independent at the state election. Now, she says, in fact, the public should have been informed immediately, doesn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. When these brevitoxins were discovered, the public should have been informed and the health advice should have been changed. That discovery of brevitoxins was a moment to level with the public and say, look, we're dealing with not only an unprecedented algal bloom in its scale, but also one for the first time that contains brevitoxins. And this has, really serious issues, particularly for those who are asthmatics.
Now, it was slow about changing the advice about whether it was a toxic bloom or not. I think most people, if they had been told that there was a nerve toxin in there, would have looked at that advice and made a judgment call themselves.
But the thing is, it did take the government 4 months, didn't it, to change its health advice. It didn't do that till September last year.
Look, this is the really strange thing about this ecological disaster. Despite it being in no way the South Australian government's fault, they were constantly trying to play it down. They were trying to minimise it or minimise the impact. They were trying not to spook the public. And so it took them 4 months from the first discovery of those brevitoxins until they finally changed the health advice. And at that point, they did change the health advice because they say they discovered brevitoxins within the metropolitan area of Adelaide. They'd really given out some, at best, mixed signals to the community.
Well, Angus, you did sit down for your Four Corners story with the South Australian Premier, Peter Malinauskas, to ask him about all of this. Originally, he had told the public that this bloom was not toxic.
A lot of people don't refer to the algal bloom as the toxic algal bloom. It's not toxic. If you went into the water and you encountered the algal bloom, you're not going to have any sort of severe, lasting health impacts. At worst, you'll have an irritation.
His comment around the algal bloom not being toxic was really bizarre because it was after the health advice had been changed, after the government had acknowledged the fact that there were brevitoxins in the bloom. So they'd been very slow to acknowledge that the bloom was toxic and did contain these brevitoxins. But then even after that, the Premier was trying to play it down. So when I put that to him, he said, you've got to understand the context with which I made those remarks.
You said the algal bloom is not toxic. Do you still believe that?
Well, it's all about the context in which those remarks have been made, and context matters when you're communicating to the people of South Australia.
So is it toxic?
Well, the harmful algal bloom produce, in this place, with the Corenia cristata in particular, it does produce a brevitoxin, and of course by its nature, brevitoxin has toxicity and therefore is toxic. But it's also true that the algae itself, or elements of the algae, aren't toxic. You want to make sure you get the balance right by informing people without unnecessarily frightening them.
And of course, there were people getting sick. It wasn't like people weren't being affected at this point.
Yeah, in August, the Seven Network had a public forum that was televised, and one woman stood up and said, "My daughter's an asthmatic.
My eldest, who is a non-asthmatic but never been in hospital, ended up in hospital for 3 days with respiratory issues."
And Nicola Spurrier, the Chief Public Health Officer for South Australia, she said, "Look, that is not possible. The asthma attack could not have been triggered by the algae because we don't have these brevitoxins in the algae in South Australia."
It is a question we've been hearing a lot. Professor Spurrier, what is your advice on this one?
It's not toxic, but when you get it in your eyes, it's irritating, and that can cause those symptoms.
That's healthy people. What about people with underlying health concerns like asthma or pre-existing respiratory issues?
We don't believe that those people are at any higher risk. In Florida, where there's a brevitoxin, they think that the toxin is more of a trigger for people with asthma, but we don't have that as a problem here in South Australia.
For the Chief Public Health Officer to come out and so strongly dismiss someone's symptoms like this was just extraordinary.
So what has Nicola Spurrier had to say now? You've had an interview with her as well.
She said at the time she was not aware that brevitoxins, or that she didn't know that brevitoxins were present in the algae.
Well, in retrospect, of course, we've now know, it's great now that we know, and I'm so pleased Sean has been able to quantify it, and we know it's from the Corenia cristata. And as soon as I had that information from that foaming event at Henley Beach, I used the precautionary principle and told the South Australian public about that.
And Angus, this could happen anywhere. And as a public, I guess we feel like we should be told if there's something in the environment that is toxic for our health.
It's an environmental disaster for South Australia, but it really is a warning for the rest of the country on two fronts, really. Firstly, there's no doubt that climate change is playing a part in this algal bloom. We don't really know what the exact causes are, but most people think that climate change is one factor here. But the other thing it's a warning to governments that they need to be prepared for these freak events driven by climate change, and that they're going to have to respond quickly, and perhaps they have to say to the public, look, we don't have all the answers. We don't really know what's happening here, and our advice will change as the science comes in. And that was the real thing that South Australia didn't do. They got locked into a very early position that it wasn't harmful, that it wasn't toxic. And even as all the evidence changed, they refused until really the very last minute to change their health advice. And that's the big lesson for the rest of the country. You need to be flexible. You need to change your advice as the scientific evidence changes.
Angus Grigg is a reporter with Four Corners. You can watch his report tonight on ABC TV at 8:30 or on iView. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed. Audio production by Cinnamon Nippard. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.